Most people who leave a narcissist share a very strange moment in common. Not the breakup, not the moment of discovering betrayal, but an ordinary day, when you realize you no longer want to prove anything. You no longer want to explain, no longer want to be understood, no longer want them to acknowledge right or wrong. And that seemingly small moment is exactly what causes the narcissist to begin losing control. Because contrary to what people often believe, a narcissist does not live off love, nor do they live off relationships. They live off reactions. Of someone still being angry, still hurt, still resentful, still in pain because of them. Even resentment is a form of connection. As long as you are still pulled in, they still exist. And that is why many narcissists do not collapse when you leave, but instead become obsessed when you remain in your own life, yet are no longer playing their game. There is a paradox that is very hard to accept. They can tolerate being hated, but they cannot tolerate no longer being defined. They can tolerate being spoken badly about, but they cannot tolerate not being mentioned anymore. They can tolerate being replaced, but they cannot tolerate you no longer needing their presence in order to feel like yourself. That is not an ordinary loss. It is a complete withdrawal from the power system they once operated within. This video is not meant to recount what they did wrong or how much you suffered. It exists to explain why some narcissists never truly recover after you leave, even though on the surface they continue to live, to love, to smile. And why the thing they cannot get past begins with something very simple. You stop reacting. Part 1. They didn't lose you. They lost your function. The first thing that must be clarified, if we want to understand why a narcissist never truly recovers after you leave, is to dismantle a very common misconception. You were never loved by them in the ordinary human sense. Not because you were unworthy, but because their psychological structure does not operate through attachment, it operates through function. In the inner world of a narcissist, people are not independent subjects. They are components assigned roles that maintain the ego. When you were with them, you were not just a lover, a wife, a husband, or a companion. You were their external emotional regulation system. You absorbed the anxieties they could not process on their own. You reflected back to them the sense that they had value, appeal, and power. When they were angry, you were the one who absorbed it. When they felt empty, you were the one who filled the void. When they felt shame, you carried that shame for them by blaming yourself. And over time, this role became so invisible that even you failed to realize you had been transformed from a person into a psychological function. This is why many people ask, if they didn't love me, why did they hurt when I left? The answer is this: they did not hurt because they lost you. They hurt because they lost what you did for them. You once kept their false ego structure standing. You were the mirror that allowed them to avoid confronting their inner emptiness. When you leave without clinging, without begging, without explaining, without trying to prove your worth, what collapses is not the relationship, but their entire internal operating system. Carl Jung once noted that human beings can endure loss, but struggle profoundly when a psychological structure they use to avoid themselves is taken away. For a narcissist, you were part of that structure. You spared them from having to face the shadow, the vulnerable, empty, imperfect parts they bury. When you disappear from that role, the shadow has nowhere left to be dumped. It turns back toward the subject, and that is when real anxiety begins. This also explains why they may quickly find someone new, yet remain obsessed with you. The new person is merely a replacement. You were a support pillar. You are not easily replaced, not because you were special in a romantic sense, but because you adapted so deeply that you became embedded in their psychological survival mechanism. When that pillar disappears, everything begins to shake, even if on the surface they continue to smile, to love, to live. And here's the crucial point. If you leave in anger, resentment, or in an effort to prove that they were wrong, you are still providing a function. But if you leave through emotional withdrawal, you are not just leaving the relationship, you are exiting the system. For a narcissist, that is not a breakup, it is a loss of access. And from that moment on, what follows is no longer about love, but a sequence of reactions aimed at restoring the function that was lost. In the next section, we will address something essential. Why discard, even when they are the one who leaves you, is still not their victory. And why power only truly ends when you no longer react. Part 2. Why discard is not their victory. One of the biggest illusions that both narcissists and their victims tend to believe is this: whoever leaves first is the one who wins. If they are the one who discards you, if they walk away coldly, if they move on to someone new very quickly, it is commonly assumed that they have moved on, are no longer affected, and now hold the upper hand. But at a deeper psychological level, discard is not the end of power. It is merely a move within a cycle of control. For a narcissist, discard is not the end of a relationship. It is a test. They want to see, how will you react? Will you chase them? Will you collapse? Will you try to explain, beg, or prove your worth? Because as long as you are still reacting, their power system remains operational. Discard only truly has meaning when it creates emotional chaos on your side. This is the crucial point that very few people recognize. Narcissists do not measure relationships by emotional connection, but by the degree of control. They may be the one who leaves, but in their mind, you are still supposed to remain trapped in pain, confusion, or quietly hoping for the day they return. When that does not happen, when you do not chase, do not panic, do not try to pull them back, discard immediately loses its effect. And at that point, what is wounded is not the relationship, but their illusion of power. Carl Jung described how the human ego can maintain stability through defensive structures until reality stops responding the way it expects. For a narcissist, discard is a way of forcing reality to comply with an old script. I matter. I have the right to leave, and the other person will collapse because of me. When that script fails to play out, they begin to enter a state of internal disorientation. This is why many narcissists continue to monitor your social media after discarding you, continue to hoover, provoke, or find indirect ways to insert themselves into your life. Not because they miss you in any healthy sense, but because they need to check whether their power has truly been lost. Discard only works if you are still being pulled in. When you are not, discard backfires. This also explains why some narcissists move on to a new partner very quickly, yet remain deeply unsettled. The new person is not a connection, but a temporary device meant to patch the crack in their sense of power. But if you, the former partner, do not react, do not show jealousy, do not compare yourself, do not display public suffering, the new person cannot fulfill that psychological function. Because the issue is not whether someone is beside them, but that the person who exited the system does not return. And it is precisely here that a paradox emerges. The narcissist may be the one who walks away, yet they cannot tolerate your calm acceptance of it. They may leave, but they cannot endure the fact that you do not need their return in order to feel okay. Discard is designed to preserve power, but when it meets silence and emotional withdrawal, it becomes a signal of lost control. In the next section, we will move into the core of the issue. What narcissists never recover from is not that you left, but your silent refusal when you no longer react, no longer participate, and no longer need them to define who you are. Part 3. Silent refusal. The narcissistic wound that cannot heal. There is a kind of rejection that a narcissist is not prepared to face. Not harsh words, not criticism or the exposure of truth, but a silence that no longer carries expectation. When you leave without carrying anger, when you do not demand answers, when you do not need them to admit wrongdoing in order for you to keep living. This is no longer a breakup. It is a withdrawal from the entire stage. What causes the narcissist to collapse here is not that you no longer love them, but that you no longer need them to validate your own emotions. In the narcissistic psychological structure, other people's emotional reactions are fuel. Anger, pain, jealousy, resentment, all of these prove one thing: I still have influence. But when you offer them no reaction at all, you are not merely rejecting them, you are rejecting the central role they have always assumed belonged to them. Carl Jung referred to this phenomenon as withdrawal from participation mystique, the unconscious participation in another person's psychological world. When that participation ends, the narcissist no longer has anyone to regulate them from the outside. The shadow, the anxiety, emptiness, and shame no longer has a place to be projected. It turns back toward the subject, and this is the moment when they can no longer self-soothe. Silent refusal is especially devastating because it gives them no story to cling to. If you react angrily, they can tell themselves that you are crazy, toxic, or obsessed. If you beg, they can believe you are weak. But when you withdraw calmly, there is no script left to explain it. No clear villain, no battle to win, only a void where validation once existed. This is why, after your silence, they often shift into provocation. They provoke not because they truly want to return, but because they need to test one thing. Do I still exist in your mind? A vague message, an indirect insult, a social media gesture, all of it is designed to restore the flow of reaction. If you react, even slightly, the system can start running again. If you do not, the wound deepens. The paradox is this: a narcissist can endure being hated far longer than they can endure being irrelevant. Being hated is still a position. Irrelevance means being removed from the structure altogether. And it is precisely this sense of having no place that creates a fracture they cannot repair because it does not come from the outside. It comes from your complete withdrawal of energy. At this stage, many people misunderstand and think they're not reacting, so they must not care. The truth is the opposite. Your silence forces them to confront a question they have always avoided. If there is no reaction from others, who am I? And because there is no stable answer to that question, they attempt to patch the gap with increasingly extreme behaviors. Smear campaigns, playing the victim, revenge, or rushing into a new relationship. But none of these behaviors heal the core wound: wordless refusal. Because you did not just say no to them, you said no to the entire system of emotional dependency they built around you. From that moment on, power no longer belongs to them. It has left the game. In the next section, we will look directly at the escalating chain of reactions narcissists typically deploy when they can no longer tolerate silence, and why those reactions, rather than saving them, end up exposing the deepest weakness in the narcissistic structure. Part 4. When they can no longer tolerate silence. Escalation, smear campaigns, and the panic of the narcissistic structure. When your silence lasts longer than a narcissist can tolerate, something crucial begins to happen inside them. The belief that they are still in control starts to collapse. Not all at once, but layer by layer, step by step, like a building erected on an empty foundation, which begins to shake the moment a supporting pillar is removed. At this stage, the narcissist is no longer acting from a position of power. They are acting from panic. But here's the danger. Narcissistic panic never presents itself openly. It is covered by familiar tactics: provocation, smearing, playing the victim, and escalating control. On the surface, they may appear proactive, but at a deeper level, they are reacting to a reality they cannot accept. You have exited the system. The first move is usually subtle provocation. Not a genuine apology, not a clear attempt to return, but ambiguous signals, a half-hearted message, a question without context, an action that makes you wonder, what do they want? The purpose of provocation is not connection. It is to awaken a reaction. Because for a narcissist, as long as you are confused, thinking, analyzing, they are still inside your mind. If provocation fails, they move on to smearing. This is when many people experience a second injury, not from the relationship itself, but from the way the story is rewritten. Narcissists do not smear because you are bad. They smear because they need a narrative to protect the ego. In that narrative, you must become cruel, ungrateful, unstable, or unfaithful, not to convince the world, but to convince themselves that your leaving had nothing to do with them. Carl Jung noted that when the shadow is threatened, people will do everything they can to project it outward. For the narcissist, smearing is the projection of shame, emptiness, and the feeling of being rejected onto you. You become the problem. So they do not have to face the more painful question. How could someone who once stayed leave without looking back? If smearing still does not pull you back, escalation begins. And escalation is not always loud. Sometimes it looks civilized. Lawsuits, disputes, drawn-out procedures, indirect pressure through others. Sometimes it is subtle. Manipulating public opinion, playing the victim, telling their story of suffering to everyone except you. The objective remains the same: to force a connection in which you must react, even if you do not want to. What must be understood is this: narcissists cannot tolerate irrelevance. They can endure anger, blame, even hatred. But when you no longer exist in any role, not as an enemy, not as a lover, not as someone who needs them, they lose orientation. Escalation, therefore, is not strength. It is a desperate attempt to re-establish a role. There is a pivotal moment many people experience but struggle to name. It is when you realize they seem willing to do anything to provoke a reaction, yet show no desire to heal, no accountability, no consistent change. Only the repetition of old tactics at a higher intensity. This is the sign that the narcissist is no longer seeking a relationship, they are seeking psychological survival. At an even deeper level, this escalation reveals a difficult truth. Narcissists do not truly believe they exist in a stable way without someone reacting to them. When you are silent, you inadvertently place them before an inner void they have spent their entire lives avoiding. And because they lack the internal tools to self-soothe, they must act outwardly. The more they act, the more extreme they become, the more exposed the inner emptiness is. This is also the point where many people begin to blame themselves. If I stay silent, why do they get worse? The answer does not lie with you. Your silence does not create the escalation. It only exposes what was already there. Before, your energy covered it. Now that the energy has withdrawn, the true structure is revealed. It is important to note that escalation is not the final stage. It is a transitional phase. Either the narcissist finds another source of supply to temporarily patch the structure, or they fall into exhaustion, depletion, and a bitter withdrawal. But regardless of which scenario unfolds, one thing is irreversible. You are no longer in their system, and that permanently shifts the balance of power. The most painful part of this phase does not lie in the narcissist's behavior, but in learning to stand steady within your own silence. Not silence out of fear, not silence in hopes they will change, but silence because you understand that any reaction would only pull you back into an old loop. This is the phase where many people falter, return, or give one more chance, not because they still love, but because they cannot bear the psychological pressure. But if you move through this phase, a profound transformation begins. You stop reacting according to the script. You begin to see that peace does not come from them stopping, but from you no longer participating. And at that moment, The narcissist loses something they can never reclaim: the ability to pull you back into the old role. In the next section, we will address a major question many people ask: why a new source of supply cannot heal the fracture created by your silence, and why, even if they continue to live and to love, part of them remains permanently stuck at the moment you walked away. Part 5. Why a new supply can never replace you. On the surface, the story looks very simple. They leave, then quickly find someone new. Photos, smiles, enthusiastic introductions, and a familiar conclusion forms in the mind of the one left behind. Maybe I wasn't enough. Maybe they found something better. But the psychological truth exists on an entirely different level. A new supply is not a replacement. It is an attempt to patch a crack, and patching is never the same as healing. What must be clearly understood is this: a narcissist does not seek people. They seek functions. The new person is not loved for who they are, but for their ability to perform parts of the role you once fulfilled: admiration, reaction, ego support, anxiety, regulation. But here lies the decisive difference. You were a stable pillar, while the new person is only a temporary lever. A pillar keeps a structure standing. A lever merely prevents it from collapsing immediately. Why can you not be replaced? Not because you were special in some destined or romantic sense, but because of the depth of integration. You stayed long enough for their system to adapt around your presence. You understood their emotional rhythms, absorbed their disturbances, and carried the shame they could not touch. Over time, you were no longer someone across from them. You became part of their psychological survival mechanism. When you withdrew in silence, that mechanism lost a component, not a name. New supply often appears quickly because panic demands immediate soothing. But that very speed is a sign of fragility. There is no time to understand, to build, to endure, only time to perform. And performance always needs an audience. When the old audience no longer reacts, the new stage must be brighter, louder, more extravagant. That is why new relationships often begin intensely and fracture just as quickly. At a deeper level, what causes new supply to fail is not that they are inferior to you. It is that they do not carry the system's memory. They have no history of holding the load. They do not know the collapse points you supported for years. When they fail to react in the right places, when they do not regulate at the right rhythm, the narcissist begins to feel a misalignment. And that misalignment triggers comparison not of love, but of efficiency. Carl Jung described a phenomenon known as mask fatigue, the exhaustion of the persona when it must operate without inner support. With a new person, the mask must work constantly. There is no place to rest. No one who understands without words to reduce the load. As a result, even with someone new, the narcissist is pulled back to an old anchor point in the mind, the place where the system once functioned more smoothly. This is not missing you as a person. It is missing the state of stability you once provided. And it is here that a painful paradox arises for the one left behind. If they have someone new and are still obsessed with me, then what was I? The answer is uncomfortable but freeing. You were a regulation tool, and you stopped performing that function. Obsession is not leftover love. It is the consequence of lost regulation. A system that has grown dependent on external regulation reacts violently when that regulation is removed. Some ask, what if the new supply is very compatible, very compliant, very tolerant? The answer is this: the system may last longer, but the cost will be higher, because with each repetition, the mask thins, the shadow grows heavier, and the devaluation discard cycle accelerates. Not because the new person did something wrong, but because the structure is never healed. Healing requires turning inward. Replacement only allows the system to keep running. The most important thing for you at this stage is not comparison. Comparison pulls you back onto the old stage. What matters is recognizing this. The new supply exists to help them avoid facing themselves, while your departure forced them to face themselves, even if only for a moment. That moment left a fracture that no new relationship can repair, because it does not lie in the other person. It lies in your absence as a function. And when you understand this, a shift occurs within you. You stop asking, "Why are they doing this?" and begin asking, "How do I need to live so I am no longer pulled back?" From here on, the story no longer revolves around them. It revolves around how you maintain your withdrawal, how you preserve your energy, and how you step into a state where power does not come from being chosen, but from no longer needing to participate at all. Part 6. What actually changes in you when you leave the right way? There is a dangerous misunderstanding that many people carry with them after leaving a narcissist, that winning means watching them suffer, collapse, or pay a price. But if you look deeply enough, a very different truth emerges. The decisive change does not happen in them, it happens in your inner structure. And this change is not loud, not dramatic, and at first often deeply uncomfortable. When you leave the right way without chasing, without begging, without trying to explain, without needing closure, the first thing that appears is not peace. The first thing is emptiness, a very real emptiness, where you were once accustomed to reacting, adjusting, carrying the load, and living in a state of constant hypervigilance. Suddenly, you no longer have a role to perform. A nervous system that had been programmed to process another person's emotions finds itself with nothing to do. And it is precisely here that many people panic and go back. But if you stay with that emptiness long enough, another process begins. Energy returns. Before, your energy flowed outward to keep the relationship functioning. Now it is forced to return to your body, your emotions, your life. This is not a pleasant sensation. It is like unplugging a machine from its power source. Everything goes quiet, and then you have to learn how to operate on your own. At a deeper level, you are doing something you had never done before. You stop regulating someone else's emotions. You no longer try to guess what they are thinking. You no longer arrange your words to avoid triggering their anger. You no longer blame yourself for their volatility. And this creates a subtle but decisive shift. Inner boundaries begin to form. Carl Jung called this process individuation, the movement by which a person withdraws from unconscious identifications and returns to the self. Before, you were identified with roles like the peacemaker, the rescuer, the one who endures, the one who understands. When you leave, these identifications fall away. You no longer know exactly who you are, and it is precisely this not knowing that opens the possibility of restructuring. There is a very strange moment in this phase. You realize you no longer want to prove anything. You no longer want to prove that you were right. You no longer want to prove that you were hurt. You no longer want to prove that they were wrong. The urge to explain the force that once exhausted you gradually dissolves. And when it dissolves, a very quiet form of power emerges, the power of non-participation. This does not make you cold. On the contrary, it makes you clear. You begin to distinguish between what is truly your emotion and what you once carried for someone else. You begin listening to your body again, where you are tired, where you are tense, where you are afraid. Signals that were once ignored now become information, and you realize a simple but unsettling truth. Peace does not come from someone else changing. It comes from no longer placing yourself in the position of having to fix them. At this stage, many people start to worry. If I become this detached, am I becoming numb? The answer is no. Numbness is paralysis. Detachment here is fullness. You do not need to react because you are not lacking. You do not need to argue because you are not being violated. You do not need to win because you have exited the game. And this is the point the narcissist can never reach: self-regulation. They need reaction in order to exist. You learn how to exist without reaction. They need others to tell them who they are. You begin to know who you are even without validation. This gap is not moral, and it is not surface-level intelligence. It is structural. When self-regulation takes shape, your life begins to change in very concrete ways. You sleep more deeply. You ruminate less. You choose relationships more slowly. You are no longer drawn to drama. You become more sensitive to your own boundaries. And most importantly, you are no longer attractive to systems that require your sacrifice in order to function. Here, the story returns to the opening point of the video, but with a new meaning. What the narcissist never recovers from is not losing you. It is that you are no longer standing in the old position they could return to. You have shifted into a different structure, and that structure does not grant them access, no matter how hard they try. By the end of this journey, what matters most is not what the narcissist did after you left, how they smeared you, how they escalated, or whom they tried to replace you with. Those things once needed to be understood, because you lived inside a system where truth was constantly distorted. But once your inner structure has changed, those questions no longer occupy the center. Not because they have perfect answers, but because they are no longer necessary for your life. What the narcissist never recovers from is not losing you as a person. It is losing access to you as a function. When you no longer react, no longer explain, no longer carry their emotions or their shame for them, a door closes not through words, but through complete withdrawal. On the other side of that door, they may continue to live, to love, to perform. But there is one place they can never return to, your former role within their system. And on this side of the door, something very different is happening. You do not defeat them. You exit the game. You do not need their acknowledgement. You do not need them to change. You do not need answers in order to go on. That does not make you colder. It makes you freer. Free from having to prove. Free from having to rescue. Free from having to remain inside systems that require your disappearance for someone else to feel that they exist. Perhaps this is the quietest ending and also the deepest. There is no applause, no moment of victory. There is only a truth that holds over time. You are no longer in a position where you can be pulled back. And that, rather than pain or punishment, is what the narcissist never recovers from. If you are listening to these words and realize that you once left in silence, know this: you did not run away. You completed something very rare. You withdrew from a structure that could not heal itself, and chose to live a life that does not require you to sacrifice yourself so that someone else can avoid facing who they are. And from that point on, the story no longer revolves around them. It begins to revolve around you.